Okay, our broadcast has started. It's my honor to be in conversation with the very esteemed professor Annette Gordon-Reed of Harvard University, who's the Carl M. Loeb University Professor, which is a big, big deal at Harvard University. She's the author, really, of one of my favorite books, the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, The Hemingses of Monticello, and she lives in New York and Cambridge. And her latest book, which we're talking about, is On Juneteenth. And this is really a fantastic book that blends memoir and history and contemporary history, you know, everything from what happened last summer. And it's really a Texas story. It's sort of like a Texas love story. I have over here Texas as a metaphor for the best and most difficult aspects of American democracy and history. That's what I came up with after reading this. So one, Professor Gordon-Reed, it's an honor to talk to you, and welcome,
Well,
to the book
thank you.
festival.
Thank you. It's good to be here. I so wish I could be in San Antonio, where I've never been, believe it or not. But maybe someday, definitely.
So I want to start off by saying that this is really an impressive book. I enjoyed this book so much. It's fluently written and it has such a big intellectual punch. Um, it's also a family memoir as well. I mean, tell me, what does it mean to be from Conroe, Texas? I've lived in Texas the last 6 years as a native New Yorker. I've absolutely come to raise my family here and love Texas, but I'm coming from the East Coast and I didn't grow up here. And you very movingly talk about being from Conroe during the age of desegregation and actually
Mhm.
being one of the pioneers. And I love how you go back and forth in history seamlessly here, and you really look at paternal and maternal folks. I felt like it was finding your roots with
Yeah.
Skip Gates, and the connection to Galveston. So this is a tour de force. But tell us, what does it mean to be from Conroe, Texas?
Well, it means growing up in a place that has a large sense of itself, a state that has a large sense of itself. From the time you're a kid, it's sort of drilled into your head that Texas is special, and you are, special because you're from Texas, even if you have problems with it. And, God knows there are complaints about Texas and the racial situation and all those kinds of things. We were raised to think that you're supposed to love it in some way, or love it in a deep way, and carrying that with you to other places. uh, it never leaves you. When I meet people who are from Texas, within 3 or 4 minutes that they're from Texas, because they'll tell you, they want to let you know that. So it's a place that gives you confidence in a way in yourself. It did for me. That's what it did. And because both sides of my family were from there,
Hmm.
and that was the interesting thing. I've spent the past 20 years writing about the Randolph and the Hemmings family and other people's families. It was interesting to be doing that for myself. So both sides of my family are from Texas, from way, way, way back. On my mother's side, the you know I, it could go back to the 1820s. On my father's side, the 1850s. So this is where we all are. It's not
Hmm.
it's not a situation where I have relatives all over everywhere. We're all Texans. And so I always come back there.
Okay. Um, you write that becoming educated was an act of resistance when
Hmm.
you were going to school. And you very movingly write about the way in which racial integration impacted Black teachers
Hmm.
and not
Hmm.
just Black students. Um,
Hmm.
but tell us about your story in terms of Conroe being, you integrated the elementary school in Conroe, the impact of that, how some Black kids saw you versus some of your new white classmates. Your mother was a teacher. Your mother was a
Yes.
teacher.
Hmm.
So it's such a rich family history as well. Tell us about that.
Yeah. Well, my mother was a teacher. She taught um, high school English
Hmm.
and in the Black school. And around this time, that obviously the mid 60s, everybody's the ferment and the civil rights movement and so forth. And there was resistance in Texas. And what
Hmm.
they came up with was this idea, and they and other places, a freedom of choice plan, where white people were supposed to choose the white school, or the black kids' families were supposed to choose the black schools. But my parents decided not to play along with that. They said, I had two older brothers in the black school where my mother taught. It was K through 12. And they figured that the rules were going to change and the schools would be integrated, and that they might as well, since I was, I had been in kindergarten in the black school, but since I was starting real school, full day school, that they would put me in Anderson Elementary School. And it was a decision that shocked a number of people. I think and I talk about in the book, that there was great ambivalence on the part of, or a sense of that we were traitors in some way, because she was teaching at a black school. What message was she and my father sending to send me to a white school? Didn't they think that the black school was good enough where she was teaching? But that really wasn't it. I think in later years, when they became a little disillusioned at how things had turned out, actually, it was not, things didn't turn out the way that they thought it was going to turn out. And they kind of played down their idealism and said, well, my father said, well, I sent you there because I wanted, I didn't want you with bigger kids. I wanted the elementary school, and they came up with other reasons as to why they sent me, but they were pretty idealistic. Everybody was sort of on the march then. And they thought that this was a part of the movement to do this. But a number of black people, as I said, felt that this was a vote of no confidence, and there was some hostility towards me. And I had this, I talk in the book about being a person that other people knew and sometimes were very hostile towards, even though I didn't know who they were. But my reputation preceded me, and I was the person who had caused all of this, but I really hadn't. The courts, the federal court caused all of that. And so it was a mixed bag. And my mother, loved teaching, loved her students, but she had become a teacher to teach black students. She thought this education was striking a blow against white supremacy. It was striking a blow against discrimination. And she loved her white students and black students, but it was a different. It was not. It wasn't being on the mission in the same way. And she couldn't talk to the black kids the way they talked to them at Washington, saying, talking to them openly about their situation being black in America. In a mixed class, you really can't do that, because particularly in my town, because we were a minority, she would have maybe 2 or 3 black kids in a class at a time. And it just didn't, it changed the nature of her profession and what she had gone into it for. So it was good and bad. I think it was, it taught me a lot being in those circumstances, and it helped shape my personality, I think. Or maybe, I don't know, maybe I had the perfect personality for it. But I learned a lot there, and it made me a sense of it. It is a sense of history now. I have a bust in the park there, and there's a mural on the wall there, and so it's weird being this person that had this moment, but it was my parents, obviously their decision to do this.
I want to visit Conroe, Professor Gordon-Reed, to see your mural and the bust as well. I really do. I really want to. There's so much to talk about. I want to talk about origin stories, Africans in Texas. This was one of my favorite chapters because one of the things you talk about is the way in which, when we bring the narrative of Texas back, we bring the narrative of the United States, and we don't just narrow it to English speaking. You look at Estebanico, you looked at Sojourner Truth, and she spoke Dutch. Estebanico spoke Spanish. When we look at St. Augustine and sort of the Spanish Empire and African influences there, the Dutch empires, we really see such a fully rounded portrait of African Americans. And you also do something I thought was amazing, looking at Native peoples. I didn't know the origin words of Texas, Tejas, and the Texans. I mean, this is extraordinary. It's a tour de force, and it packs so much power, and it's so readable. It was extraordinary. So tell us about that. I was really fascinated.
Well, I thought that it was important, since I'm writing about Texas, to remind people that there is a Spanish influence, and that Spanish people, people of African descent, came to the Americas, the so-called New World, the world basically, with the Spanish, in the 1500s, and they were doing all kinds of things. Estebanico was enslaved, but as you mentioned, he was at some point served as a translator between the Spanish and the Native American people that whom they encountered. He apparently had a gift for languages, and people, he did that. There were other African people who went down into Mexico and in Central America and so forth. And so it's just, to my mind, I wanted to find some way to talk about how Black people are connected, not connected just through the English. And I say in the book, it's as if English people sort of invented African Americans, and that this is these are the boundaries of our lives. And I understand language is important, and there's a culture. I get that, but these people were bound together not because of the battles between the English and the whatever deals and how they drew their maps. These people were drawn together because they'd been forced from their homeland into a new world and enslaved in a world that was based upon and was developing a notion of white supremacy. So we have points of connection with Black people all over the world. Yeah. I mean, we're not a monolith, but dealing with this problem of being seen as, for these people, as worthy of or eligible for enslavement, who were on the bottom of a hierarchy and who had to struggle. It's not the same struggle everywhere. It's different, but there's an ideology that has formed these people's lives, all of our lives, whether we speak Spanish or French or English or whatever, and it's recognizable. So I just wanted to bring that home so people, it's interesting that I was born in a state and grew up in a state where that connection could be made. And I thought it was important to talk about.
Why do these stories matter, and why do the narratives that we tell ourselves about our nation mean so much, arguably now more than ever? You've got a great quote in the origin stories where, and it's actually something I'm going to use as an epigraph for something I'm writing right now. On page 55, chapter 2, you say, origin stories matter for individuals, groups of people, and for nations. They inform our sense of self, telling us what kind of people we believe we are, what kind of nation we believe we live in. I thought that was really extraordinarily profound. Tell us about that. Right now, we've been talking about African Americans. You do a great job of threading in the Native American indigenous experience. Great. I mean, it's a tour de force. Everybody should read On Juneteenth. This should be a national bestseller. And as somebody who teaches in Texas, this should be in every school in Texas, because it's really, which I'm going to say at the end, really a love letter to Texas. But love also means being critical. Love means being critical, because you absolutely, you could tell your love for Texas, your love for America. And I share that love, and I think you do a great job of that, because I think too often those of us who are interested in these issues of justice, it doesn't come out, I think, enough that we love the place. And that's why we want to change it. And that sounds kind of corny or old-fashioned, but I think it's important.
No, it's true. It's true. If it didn't matter, you'd do something else. I mean, you would spend that time talking about these kinds of things and having hopes for it, and wanting to have a future that, that's brighter and that we could all share in. I mean, I think this matters because I think young people need to have a sense of themselves, a sense of the past and where they came from. And you don't dwell in the past. You can't stay there and say that that's the only thing that counts. But people need to know. It was amazing to me to find my great grandfather's voter registration. In 1867 in Texas, and to know that it wasn't going to, by 1870 this is over. Reconstruction is over. The people the people that I didn't know anything about, Black legislators. I mean, I knew they existed, but the kinds of things that they did, that they were involved in, the sacrifices that they made, I think people need to know that folks did some amazing things in some really
Mhm.
difficult times. We live in difficult times now too, but they lived in it, thinking of being a person in Reconstruction Texas, era
Yeah.
Texas, when, after the end of the war, people were so angry. Whites were
Mhm.
so angry at what had happened, and they basically, they, you know, enacted all kinds of violence on people. And these folks just kept going. They kept getting involved in politics to the extent that they could. It was amazing to find out, to think about my great grandfather working on the wharves in
Yeah. Oh, wow.
Galveston. He had a
Yeah.
farm in Moscow, Texas, and he would go down to Galveston, when everything was taken care of on the farm. I think they hired a couple of guys to work there with my grandmother and her sisters and his daughters, and he would go down to Galveston and to find out that there were Black men who had sort of like unions and during that time period and were working on the wharves and were making claims for themselves in a time period when you just don't think. I mean, I know that some of these things existed, but I really wanted people, the general public, to think about this, that there's always been activity in among African Americans and people who are striving from the very beginning, taking whatever was available to them and trying to make something of it. So I think young people need to know those stories, because if they could do those kinds of things, think of the kinds of things that we could do.
And Professor Gordon-Reed, I want you to connect your family history in Galveston to what you also explore with the Freedmen's Bureau, General Howard,
Mm-hmm.
the General Order number 3. And you say at
Mm-hmm.
one point that Galveston during the 1860s is sort of a microcosm, Galveston, Texas,
Mm-hmm.
a microcosm of sort of the hopes and dreams of American democracy
Mm-hmm.
right after the Civil War. So tell us
Mm-hmm.
about, first of all, General Granger, when we think about Juneteenth and
Mm-hmm.
the order number 3, and
Mm-hmm.
really the fact that, Galveston, like you said, your family working on the wharves, but Galveston is where one of the early branches of the Freedmen's Bureau
Yeah.
opens up. And
Mm-hmm.
I
Mm-hmm.
think that's extraordinary.
Yeah, yeah. And so it's a center of activity, the center of the beginning to try to bring um, Black people into citizenship after chattel slavery. And it was a diverse city. And I grew up in Galveston. I mean, I grew up in Texas, and I think about Galveston. I just think about the beach. I didn't, I'd never associated it with the fact that it was the most important city in Texas. If I thought about it, I suppose I would have known that because it's a port, obviously. All the
Yeah.
ports in those times are the big, the big cities, the things that are important. But it was diverse, Black people, white people, people from other countries. And it was a site of, again, you're sort of imagining what it would be like to be a young man from the country, because Moscow's the country, being in what was a big city, but at the same time, the sites. If this is a short book, but it might be at some point to go back and really dig into this much more to see what it was like for Black people living in that place, with opportunities, more opportunities than they could have had, and certainly in rural areas, and the sense of being on the move. Then, of course, as I said, 1870 Reconstruction is pretty much over in Texas,
Yeah.
and you end up in a really, really tough time. But as I say in the book, African American people still keep celebrating Juneteenth,
Yes.
Emancipation Day,
Yes.
and find a way to commemorate that, and don't stop and just keep going with it up until today. And it's now it's not just us, I mean Texans, it's people all over the country who do it as well. So it's been an amazing turn from when I was a little girl celebrating it, at my grandparents' house or at our house, uh, just sort of a holiday that I thought that was for Blacks, and particularly just for Black Texans.
Mhm.
Now, whites celebrate it as well. It's a state holiday and may be a national holiday.
What are your thoughts on the fact that Juneteenth, especially in light of the events last year, George Floyd protests, the different demonstrations, has become, such a big national celebration, commemoration? Many companies gave their employees off on Juneteenth nationally, including the NFL.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly, Texas had always regarded it, but now there really is
Mm-hmm.
talk of it being a national holiday. You talk about the fact that uh, folks in Texas called it Emancipation Day.
Mm-hmm.
You went to Emancipation Park once with your
Mm-hmm.
family that you recall, but you very movingly write about celebrating it in Conroe, and near the end, the food that used to help your
Mm-hmm.
grandmother and your mother
Mm-hmm.
make, and just it's really you talk about softening the corn husks in hot water, grinding the pork, beef, or chicken, preparing the masa dough to be spread on the husk, filling the dough with the seasoned meats, and tying the tamales. The final preparation was time consuming, but it was time spent with people I loved and who are no longer with me. Um, but then at the end of the book, before the coda, you said this ritual was fitting and so very Texan. People of African descent, and to be honest, of some European descent, celebrating the end of slavery in Texas with dishes learned in slavery and a dish favored by ancient Mesoamerican Indians that connected Texas to its Mexican past. So much Texas history brought together for this one special day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, my grandmother uh, started making tamales and to raise money for the St. Luke's United Methodist Church. And my grandfather, when he retired, had a barbecue pit and to raise money for the St. Luke's United Methodist Church. And one of the things that people used to order, people ordered the barbecue all the time. They ordered tamales all the time as well. But Juneteenth was a big order day for those kinds of things. And I remember, and I do talk about making those with my grandmother and being exasperated because I'm a kid. You're a kid, you want to be out running around, but you had to help out. Of course, now I'd give anything, obviously, to be sitting around at a table with my mother and grandmother and her sister, my grandmother's sister, making hot tamales. But at the time, a kid, you just want to run off and do stuff. But it is sort of I thought it was an interesting thing to think about all of those things, all of those people brought together. That's what I wanted to do in the book. I do have a chapter, as you mentioned before, about Native Americans in Texas,
Yeah.
the indigenous people in Texas. And the fact that I was born in Livingston, which was about 17 miles or so from the Alabama Coshada Indian Reservation, which is sort of a strange. I mean, it's not a normal thing to have that connection, to be able, as a girl, making a connection to the Indian Reservation by going there. It was, I think I haven't been there in many, many years, but I gather now it has become a much larger affair. They have gaming and so forth. But then it was just more of a cultural thing. You went and there were dances and there were, they had artifacts, things that you could buy. The Native American in the 70s, Native American was chic was sort of in at that point.
Yeah.
And I talk about what it was like, Billy Jack and all those things where everybody wanted to be
Oh man,
Native American.
I love Billy Jack.
Romanticized. What?
I remember Billy Jack. There was a couple of things, Professor Gordon-Reed. You talk about Lawrence Harvey, who I remember, the British actor, and I remember the Alamo. But you talk about Billy Jack, and I remember Billy Jack, including sequels like The Trial of Billy Jack. So when I was reading this, I was all in. I was right there. Now I didn't see it at the movies, but I saw it like as a young person.
No, I saw it as the movie.
Yeah.
We went to the movies. It was there were phenomena, and that's what I said in the book. It was interesting to me to see these conservative people in town,
Yes.
who were at this film and who just loved this stuff. And Billy Jack was protecting the Freedom School, with these hippie people and the kind of people that they probably might not have liked very much, but on screen. And because I guess it was such a blunt morality tale, obviously there were good guys and bad guys. But
But like you said, he was
those,
also half Native American, so that
yeah,
let
that's
them.
right. It was
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah,
It's sort of
yeah.
like he wasn't all Native American, because I wonder
No,
if he would have
no.
been, if they could have gone all in on that if he were all Native American. But it was sort of that kind of romanticizing, and I talk about this in the
Yes,
chapter that they do
yeah,
about Native American. You know, the commercial with the guy who sees the littering and he has a single
yeah.
tear going down.
Iron Eye Cody.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. The Sicilian guy.
Yeah,
You know, yeah. It's those movies are. It's sort of hard to explain to. I would love to show them to my kids to see how they would
yeah,
respond to that. But you know, everybody was all in on this, and I talk about the kind of complexity of the situation there, and my father, who of all people romanticized Native Americans, and you know may
yeah,
have fantasized us into an Indian back ancestry, which I I doubt, but um, yeah, that was the '70s, that and kung fu fighting, which Billy Jack did as well. So this is a chance for me to sort of go down memory lane on a lot of interesting cultural and racial points, because the '60s and the '70s, those were the high water mark of a lot of things that were a lot of changes that were happening in society, and I guess it's related to today as well. Thinking
yeah.
about race and the very complicated questions about race. Yeah.
We're closing out. We're gonna start opening up for questions, but I want to ask. You have a fascinating part about the yellow rose of Texas,
Oh
and
yeah.
I did not know. And I've heard that song growing up. There was actually a show, short-lived show called Yellow Rose of Texas, on
Yeah. Yeah.
NBC or
I
ABC,
don't think I ever saw
and
it,
I've
but
known the song, but now when you put the lyrics, it's about a black woman. It's about, it's amazing. And then connecting it to Santa Ana and the idea that there was this mixed race woman who's one of the reasons he lost. And you talk about very well, like, what is the purpose of that story, that narrative, that
mhm.
mythology? I thought that was really,
Yeah.
unbelievably fascinating.
Yeah, well, as I said in the book, I'd never heard this story. You know, I had the Yellow Rose of Texas, but I'd never heard about a connection to Santa Ana until I was an adult and I came back to Texas. And then there was just this moment when this was evidently it's the story that's been told for a long time,
Hmm.
but it became a real part of lore. Uh, after I was an adult, and I see it as an attempt. People now are trying to diversify the Texas story in a way,
Hmm.
to bring Black people. I mean, it's a good thing. The impulse is good. I don't know about the Yellow Rose as the mechanism for doing that, but the idea that there's history that all people share is is important to say, even though it's kind of tough to fit it into into sort of happy mythology of Texas, because I mean, the Mexicans would have done away with slavery, and the Texians wouldn't have. So it's a complicated thing to try to get behind if you're a Texan, if you're a Black Texan, because
Yeah,
or even a
yeah.
white Texan,
You say it's a bit much to say that the black folks to try to write them into a narrative where they're trying to make sure they're not going to be free when we think about the creation of the Republic of Texas.
Yeah,
Just like, and
no,
then you talk about the mythology of the Black Confederates as well.
yeah, yeah, yeah. The lost cause people, because now you're supposed to be. It's like everybody's supposed to be diverse, but it could be people who are the least diverse. The stories that are the least diverse have to be rewritten, and I guess in a way that's I'm happy that people have come to the point where they think that this should be a broader story, but it's going to take some massaging. We got to fix to figure out how to actually do this without uh, sort of having a mythology that makes Black people happy about their own subjugation.
Yeah, I think you do it really well here because I think you're on Juneteenth. Again, this is our book on Juneteenth. It comes out uh, next month, May,
May 4th.
officially, May
May
4th.
4th.
That's the day after my mom's birthday, so I can really
Oh,
remember
cool.
that.
Hmm.
And I think you do it really well here. This braids a story of Native people, African American people, Spanish speaking people from both Spain and Mexico. And it shows the capaciousness of Africa in the New World, and even the Atlantic world and beyond, but brings it all the way up to date to our contemporaries. So I think it's just so good and so well done. And the brevity of it is amazing. And on top of it, you weave your own family story in it. Because I felt like we could have a little movie watching this, especially by the time we went to Lawrence Harvey and the Alamo and Billy Jack.
Alamo and Billy Jack and
yeah. I remember Paul Newman in the film Hombre as a blue-eyed half Native American person. It's like 1966. It's just amazing. All right,
you have to have that point of connection. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it's amazing. It's amazing. So we're going to be taking people's questions. So I'm waiting for the questions. So in lieu of that, I'll continue to chat. But I know we're supposed to be getting anybody who has a question can type in their question for Professor Gordon-Reed. What inspired you to write this book? What's the inspiration?
Well, part of the inspiration was my editor, who has been asking me to write a book about Texas for many, many years.
Okay.
And I think he was thinking about a big book of Texas. But then he thought, he said, we talked about this, and the suggestion was I could do something short, a small book that was a memoir that weaved history into it. So, as I said, after having written about other people's families for all these years, it was time to try to look at my own to a degree, and this is where I landed. To do something that didn't require a person, people to go through 400 or 500 pages. The Hemings of Monticello is long.
Yes.
And this is the opposite of that. This is the opposite. So that's what I wanted. That's what I wanted to do.
All right, drop them here in the tab. So we're still waiting on questions. When we go back to the beginning, and Estebanico, even before the founding of Mexico and the founding of Texas, I think what does it do to our story of Black people in the New World, where we get people like Estebanico, and you do talk about Sojourner Truth and the fact that she spoke Dutch, which I think is amazing, and her English was a Dutch inflected English, right? And you show how even when we think about the WPA and the slave narratives, they tried to make all the former enslaved African Americans speak in this kind of dialect, even if they didn't speak into it. And that sort of creates sort of a mythology of how people even spoke at the time. So and we have a question coming in. It says, are there specific pieces of writing, poems, or books that you turn to when you need some motivation or a creativity reboot? That's a great question.
It's a good question. Yeah, what I use more than reading things is listening to music.
Oh, okay.
I find music inspirational to me.
The next question is, what kind of music, Professor Gordon-Reed?
What kind of music do you like? It could be, I like classical music. I like piano. Any kind of piano, classical or jazz piano, and that can get me into a mood to write. So it's I would say that music is more a muse for me than reading. I mean, I'm always reading stuff. That's the thing. There's not a point where I'm not reading something. So there's nothing specific there, but it's more particular types of music to get me going.
Did you write most of this during the pandemic?
Yeah. In the summer, this past summer, we left school in March, and I suppose you guys did too, right? Or whatever that was in.
Yeah, Yeah, we left school. We did virtual though. I don't know if Harvard did virtual.
Yeah, we did. No, we went
Okay, yeah.
online. We split and went offline. But I mean, um, I left because I live in New York and Cambridge, and I came back to New York and stayed in New York. And that's when we were talking about doing this, and then I wrote it during. It's a pandemic, pandemic era book
Yes.
during this time period. Yes, um, it's a distraction. It was a distraction from being here in Manhattan, where we were sort of at ground zero with stuff, and this could take your mind off of it.
If Juneteenth did become a national holiday, what impact would that have or not on this story that you have
Mm-hmm.
here? Because from it being this very Texas specific thing, although for somebody in New York, we celebrated Juneteenth in New York City because we had Black Texans in New York. So in
Uh-huh.
our group in Queens and Brooklyn, we had Black people who told us and taught us. So I knew what it was just because it was folks from Texas who were transplanted to New York
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
in the post-war era.
Well, I think that's what happened when I left Texas and went to college, and I started hearing about people celebrating at other places. And at first, as I say in the book, I was a little resentful of that. I thought, "Hey, what are you doing?" And then this is ours. But then I realized a lot of Texans had gone places and they took it with them, and so it made sense that it would come up that way. What difference does it make? I think it would focus people on not Texas, but focus people on slavery. I think on the issue of slavery, and it's the end. What really happened? What this is not the total end of slavery. Slavery doesn't end totally, or legalized slavery doesn't end totally until the 13th Amendment is ratified
December,
by all
December
places, December
1865.
1865, and the last
Mhm.
states ratified. But this is the Confederate Army, the Army of the Trans-Mississippi um, surrendered. I mean, Appomattox had happened, but the Confederates in Texas in that area were still fighting. So
Mhm.
this was the result of the end of of the war, of the Confederate armed effort to maintain the South and its way of life, basically slavery. And you could look at it, an effort that Black soldiers, Union soldiers, Black and white, helped to bring about. And I think there's a way for us to think of it as it's an important event for those reasons. It's the end of the armed conflict, organized armed conflict over slavery, and the surrender of the Confederacy, which I think is an important thing that led to Juneteenth.
Okay, we have a question. Professor, there's a lot of contentiousness around cultural appropriation and being sensitive to the authentic history of Black Americans. Do you think we'll ever get to the place that all Americans are Black for the day on an important Black History Day, just like St. Patrick's Day? I see what the person say. We're all
Yeah.
Irish on St. Patty's Day. When all
Hmm.
Americans play Irish for the day, and would that be desirable? Yeah, that's a great question, and I think that also could potentially connect to Juneteenth, which is not just about one person like MLK, but about our experience.
Yeah. No, I think it is a good question. I think it'll be a while if something like that would happen. It'll be a while before whites want to be Black for a day. Well, I don't know that that's not, I pull that back. I mean, culturally, certainly, whites are very much into African American culture.
Yes.
Obviously, it's one of the most amazing things in the world is to step off an airplane in Sydney, Australia, or Stockholm and hear Black music, Black American music. I mean, we're everywhere. So I pull back from saying that they don't want to be like Black people for a time. But as the kind of affectionate, easy, we're all Irish thing, I think that
Yeah.
will take a while.
Okay.
Uh, and originally, I think it will be, my hope would be that it's a day to pause and reflect on what happened and how far we've come and how far we have to go. So it's about, I think it will be serious. I mean, it's fun. We had sodas and pot tamales and barbecue, and so I mean, it's a 1-2 punch. Juneteenth and then July 4th, not long
Yes.
after that. But I think it will continue to be, in the beginning, among other people, just it's more historical and thinking about, this momentous time when people cease to be treated as, by law, as chattel, and then have hope for what's going to happen to them next. Yeah, but I would look forward to it being something, a national holiday. And I know other people have other days. There's so many days that there could be. January 1st, but there's already a holiday for January 1st. It would get swamped in that. I kind of hope it happens, and it'll be interesting to see what effect it does have on, what, if any, effect it does have on citizens and people and Americans.
Now, you've written so much, very movingly. Well, there's a question: is there an up-and-coming writer and historian whose work that you'd like to draw attention to?
Mm-hmm. Tamika Nunley, who is a wonderful historian. Rob Parkinson, who's he's more than, he's already here. They're and the names are popping. My names are leaving my mind here as you ask me these things. Josh Rothman has a new book about the internal slave trade. That's important. This is a wonderful, it. I mean, this is a wonderful time for writing about.
Oh yeah.
About slavery history, American history, not just slavery, or not even just Black history. There's so many things are available now, digitized, things that I remember having to go down and crank the microfilm machine, go down to Virginia to do that. Now I can go online and pull up all those newspapers and look at stuff. This is a golden age for writing about these topics. And it's just amazing what people are doing now.
All right, so we're gonna stop the questions. I want to thank Professor Annette Gordon-Reed for this conversation on Juneteenth. I think this book sets up, I've written Texas as a metaphor for the best and most difficult parts of American democracy and American history. This is really brilliant and so well done and so moving, and I learned so much. It's always fun to just learn and be curious. Any final remarks or thoughts?
Well, this is interesting. My thoughts that it's fun to be in this position, to be writing about my family, to writing about a place that I love, to get out of Virginia and see the other part of America that, that I think has a lot to teach people, because I do think that Texas is, in some ways, it's the American experience all rolled into this one place. Native Americans, slavery, the West, Hispanic culture, all kinds of things, all there. Anglo culture too. So I'm glad to be able to present this to people in a form that I think is accessible, and I hope fun. I mean, I had fun writing it, and I had fun joking through it too as well. So it's.
Oh no, I had fun reading it. So I think people are going to have a lot of fun. You make me want to visit Conroe, Texas. So I live in Austin. I'm actually going to go to Conroe, Texas. I want to do. We have all kinds of trips planned. So Conroe.
Lake Conroe is great. Do you water ski?
I don't. We swim, but I haven't been courageous enough to water ski.
Lake Conroe is great.
So again, Professor Annette Gordon-Reed, who's the Carl M. Loeb University Professor at Harvard University and the author of the Pulitzer Prize winning over 16 book prizes, The Hemingses of Monticello, which really recast and reimagines and lets us really rethink about Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings and what their lives meant in actual time, but mean to us. She does so well in terms of rethinking the origin stories of American history and American democracy globally in just new and exciting and innovative ways. Her latest book is On Juneteenth, and this is a fantastic book. We're going to be reading it here in Texas, but nationally as well. Everyone should be reading this book. So thank you so much.
Lots of fun.